The third week was always the dangerous one. That's when people stopped watching you so carefully, stopped wondering if you belonged. Margaret Walsh knew this from experience that predated her nursing license by 17 years, though no one at Mercy General would ever know that. She moved through the pediatric ICU at Houston like someone perpetually apologizing for taking up space, her white shoes silent on the tile, her scrubs 2 sizes loose to hide the architecture underneath. Hands steady as surgical lasers. Posture that said I am nothing. Eyes that saw everything. Fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical drone overhead, the sound embedding itself in your brainstem after the first 8-hour shift. The smell of antiseptic hung thick in the air, sharp enough to taste, mixed with something underneath it, something that smelled like fear in a child's sweat. Margaret had learned to catalogue that smell in Fallujah, in a forward surgical team tent where the overhead fans couldn't push it away no matter how fast they spun. Here at Mercy General, it meant something different. Here it meant parents in the waiting room, hands shaking as they signed consent forms. Here it meant someone's world was being remade into smaller, harder shapes. She'd been hired on a Tuesday in August, officially listed as a pediatric trauma nurse with 12 years of civilian experience. The application mentioned only 2 prior jobs, both with appropriate gaps, both references carefully vetted by people who understood how to build a false history that held water under any reasonable scrutiny. The medical board had approved her credentials without hesitation. Her hands had saved enough lives that they carried their own kind of authority, even when her voice stayed pitched low and apologetic. 3 weeks into the shift rotation, Margaret had fallen into the rhythm of Mercy General like a stone dropping through still water. Wake at 4:48 a.m. Shower. Dress in scrubs with the left sleeve rolled slightly higher to keep the old scar hidden. Coffee from the gas station 2 blocks from her apartment, no sugar, no cream. Arrive at the hospital by 6:15 a.m., 15 minutes before her shift officially started. Spend those minutes reading the overnight reports with the kind of intensity that most nurses reserved for text messages from their children. The limp was minimal now. A mortar round in Tikrit had left shrapnel in her left hip, and the Navy trauma surgeons had pulled what they could without making her unable to walk. The rest had calcified into something like bone, something like a permanent reminder that her body had been reassembled by people who'd had exactly 43 minutes to work before the next casualty came through the tent flap. The limp showed on days when the humidity climbed above 80%, which in Houston meant it showed almost every day. Nobody at Mercy General had asked about the limp. People rarely did. They saw a quiet nurse in her mid-40s with graying hair pulled back in a surgical bun, and they saw exactly what she wanted them to see: competent, unremarkable, someone who would put in her hours and collect her paycheck and fade from memory within 3 months. Margaret had spent the last 17 years perfecting the art of being invisible to exactly the right degree. Invisible enough that people forgot to watch you. Not so invisible that they suspected you were hiding. Dr. Robert Sterling had been watching her since day one. Margaret had felt it the way you feel a laser sight before you understand it's lethal, a presence, a weight, the particular quality of attention that comes from someone trying to assess a threat. He was tall in the way wealthy men learn to be tall, shoulders back, chin elevated, wearing a $2,000 suit under his white coat like it was a costume he wore to humiliate the rest of the staff. His shoes were Italian leather, polished to the point of reflection, and they clicked on the ICU tile like a countdown. Sterling had power at Mercy General. Not because he was the best doctor. 3 of the 5 attending physicians in pediatrics were objectively more skilled than he was, but because he understood something fundamental about institutional leverage. His father-in-law sat on the hospital board. His brother managed the insurance reimbursement contracts. His ex-wife's firm handled the malpractice defense for 1/3 of the surgical staff. Power wasn't what Sterling did. Power was what Sterling was. He'd been watching Margaret start and 4 on a 3-year-old with leukemia who'd been poked 17 times in the past week by competent phlebotomists and incompetent residents. The child's veins were starting to collapse, tissue papering from repeated access. Margaret had approached the bed without ceremony, without explanation, and without the standard pediatric for pump that made most nurses feel safer. She'd asked the child's mother to step into the hall for 2 minutes. She'd asked the resident to stand back. She'd taken a single moment to feel for the child's pulse at the wrist, and then she'd slipped a 22-gauge needle into the basilic vein using a technique that looked almost like she was drawing blood, quick, decisive, the kind of precision that comes from practicing under conditions where hesitation meant people died. The child didn't cry. The 4 went live on the first attempt. The mother was called back in and Margaret was already walking toward the next patient before the woman could say thank you. Sterling had been standing at the medication cart when Margaret walked past. He hadn't said anything. He didn't need to. She'd seen his eyes register something that made his jaw clench slightly, a micro-expression that lasted maybe half a second before the arrogant mask slid back into place. He was intelligent enough to recognize competence. That was the problem. But Sterling didn't understand yet that Margaret's competence was the least threatening thing about her. He would figure that out eventually. For now, he was simply tracking the new nurse, filing away observations, the way a predator catalogues the other animals in its territory, which ones were dangerous, which ones could be ignored, which ones needed to be removed. On day 17 of her employment at Mercy General, 7-year-old Danny Mackenzie was wheeled into the pediatric ICU, and Margaret felt something inside her chest lock into place like a rifle bolt. The intake report came in first. She read it while standing at the main desk, and her fingers traced each line of his medical history the way some people trace scars. Air Force Colonel James Mackenzie. Son admitted 3 weeks prior with severe ocular trauma sustained during a mortar attack near FOB Spiker in Tikrit. Bilateral corneal lacerations. Retinal detachment, left eye. Traumatic optic nerve damage, right eye. Prognosis, total blindness. Treatment, supportive care pending neurological stabilization. Expected outcome, permanent vision loss. The charts were thick. Thicker than they should have been for a 3-week stay. Margaret started at the beginning and read every single page, every lab result, every imaging study, every note from every physician who'd consulted on the case. Her eyes moved like she was reading a military intelligence briefing, absorbing not just what was written but what wasn't written, what was implied by the gaps, what was suggested by the pattern of codes. The treatment timeline didn't match the clinical presentation. That was the first thing that caught her attention. The imaging showed significant but treatable optic nerve inflammation, swelling, pressure buildup, the kind of thing that responded to decompression if you moved fast enough. But the treatment notes documented steroids, antibiotics, anticoagulation therapy. Expensive things. Experimental things. Things that insurance companies paid for without much question when the patient was the child of a senior military officer. Margaret's jaw tightened slightly. She set the chart down on the desk with careful precision and asked the nursing supervisor where they were placing the boy. Bed 7, isolation precautions, full life support, the supervisor said without looking up from her computer. The father's been here twice. Military guy. Doesn't talk much. Looks like he's carrying the weight of something that broke a long time ago. Margaret nodded and moved toward bed 7, feeling the weight of something shift inside her, some part of her that had been sealed up since the day the Navy had told her to disappear, to never surface, to let Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh die quietly in a classified extraction operation that would never be officially declassified. Danny Mackenzie was small for 7 years old, thin in the way children become thin when they've been in hospitals long enough to forget what his home kitchen smelled like. His eyes were wrapped in careful bandaging. His right hand had an 4-line running to a pump that dripped medication into his bloodstream on a schedule determined by a doctor who'd never met him before the boy arrived at Mercy General and would never see him after he left. Margaret approached the bed and didn't say anything. She just stood there, reading the monitors, watching the rise and fall of his chest, listening to the ventilator pump air into his lungs with its steady mechanical rhythm. The boy's mother wasn't in the room, just a stuffed animal in the corner and a card on the bedside table with a child's drawing of a man in uniform standing next to a small figure holding his hand. "Hi, Danny," Margaret said quietly. "I'm Margaret. I'm going to be taking care of you for a while." The boy's head turned toward her voice. His bandaged eyes made his face look older than 7, or maybe just sadder. "Can you help me see?" he asked. Margaret's hand went to the inside of her jacket collar without conscious thought, finding the small patch there, worn canvas with the seal of Naval Special Warfare Command, the stitching coming loose at one corner, the fabric faded from sun and sweat that never came from hospital work. She let her fingers rest there for just a moment, long enough to remember what it felt like to be useful for things that mattered, and then she pulled her hand back and took Danny's small hand instead. "Let's start with this," she said. "Let's start with you getting better. Everything else comes after." That's when the anesthesiologist came in to check on the morning sedation levels, and that's when Margaret made the first mistake that would eventually change everything. She reached for Danny's line, the one that had been placed by someone competent but conventional, and without asking permission from anyone, without going through the standard pediatric protocol, she swapped it for a fresh line using the same technique she'd used in Fallujah, the same technique she'd learned in a forward surgical team tent when the only access on a critically wounded Marine was a collapsed vein and 18 minutes until the helicopter could land to fly him to a proper hospital. The needle went in smooth, clean. The kind of perfect access that only happened when your hands remembered things your mind was supposed to forget. The anesthesiologist, a young woman named Chen, went pale. She stepped closer and watched the blood return to the line, and then she whispered something that made Margaret's entire body go very still. "I saw a senior chief do that exact stick in Ramadi," Dr. Chen said. "You were there." Margaret didn't say anything. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She simply finished securing the line, checked the tape placement, and looked Dr. Chen directly in the eyes for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to communicate everything, long enough to establish what had to happen next, which was nothing. Absolutely nothing. Then she did something that even Chen might have missed if she wasn't watching carefully. Her left hand came up and she touched the inside of her jacket collar, just barely, just enough to reveal the edge of the faded patch there, worn canvas, Navy SEAL trident, the kind of thing you only carried if you'd already died once and been allowed to come back as someone else. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum. Dr. Chen blinked twice, and something shifted in her expression, recognition, understanding, the particular knowledge that comes from being in the same room as someone who'd survived things that normal people weren't supposed to survive. "Right," Chen said quietly. "Okay. I'll just monitor his levels from here." Margaret didn't respond. She simply turned back to Danny, who couldn't see her, who couldn't know that his nurse had just revealed a version of herself that she'd spent 17 years hiding, and she made herself into something small and quiet again. Just a pediatric trauma nurse. Just someone taking care of a sick child. Just someone who could disappear into the background of Mercy General and not be noticed. Behind her, somewhere in the ICU, Dr. Sterling's shoes clicked against the tile floor as he watched from the nursing station, already beginning to calculate what needed to happen next. Sterling's shoes clicked against the tile floor as he watched from the nursing station, already beginning to calculate what needed to happen next. The break room smelled like burnt coffee and the particular staleness that accumulated when too many people recycled the same air for too long. Margaret was restocking supply carts when she heard his voice rise above the ambient hum of the unit, not loud, but with the practiced projection of a man accustomed to commanding attention without effort. "I'm giving the new girl 7 days," Dr. Sterling announced, leaning against the counter with his coffee held at chest height like a scepter. His residents clustered around him, their white coats pristine, their eyes eager for whatever entertainment he was about to provide. $20 says she quits before next Monday. Any takers? The laughter came first, nervous, obligatory, the sound of junior physicians laughing at a senior doctor's joke the way salmon swam upstream. Margaret continued organizing gauze packs into the cart, her hands moving with mechanical precision. She didn't look up. She had learned long ago that acknowledgement was oxygen to men like Sterling, that the smallest reaction, a flinch or a glance, would be fed into conversation and weaponized later. So she breathed, sorted supplies, and said nothing at all. One of the residents, a woman with kind eyes and the exhausted posture of someone early in training, shifted uncomfortably. Sterling noticed. "Problem, Dr. Reeves." His tone made it clear there shouldn't be. "No, sir. Just wondering if that's appropriate." Sterling's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Welcome to medicine, Doctor. This is how we build character." He turned back to the group, raising his coffee cup like a toast. 7 days. Who's in? The room went quiet except for the ventilator wheeze coming from the nearby isolation unit. Margaret felt the silence settle on her shoulders the way rain settles on still water, not dramatic, just thorough. She finished with the cart and pushed it toward the medication room, her movement smooth and unremarkable. In her peripheral vision, she caught Dr. Chen watching her from the supply shelf, his expression unreadable but his jaw tight. He was Navy too. He had heard the bet the same way she had. The difference was she understood that disappearing from attention was its own form of power. 2 days later, the cafeteria hummed with the particular chaos of a hospital lunch rush, trays clattering, conversations overlapping, the fluorescent lights casting everything in a sickly institutional yellow. Margaret sat at the corner table she had claimed on her second day, a salad and a container of soup in front of her. She was reading Danny Mackenzie's chart on her phone, her eyes tracing the pattern of treatment Sterling had ordered. The charges didn't align. Experimental decompression therapy that had no peer-reviewed literature. For infusions marked as urgent that showed no corresponding clinical indication. Numbers that swelled like infections. She was so focused on the inconsistency that she didn't see Sterling coming until the tray hit the edge of the table. The collision happened in slow motion and fast forward simultaneously, soup launching in an arc that caught her left shoulder, a piece of bread spinning like a wheel across the floor, the tray itself clattering against the table edge before toppling. Margaret's phone went flying. She watched it happen without flinching, the way she might watch a round go down range. Sterling had orchestrated it perfectly. His timing was immaculate. He had brought an audience, for residents trailing behind him like ducklings, all of them stopping now to witness the aftermath. "Careful there, sweetheart." Sterling was already turning away, already moving toward his own table, his voice pitched for maximum carry. "Wouldn't want you to hurt yourself." His residents smiled. One of them covered it with a cough. Another looked at the floor. Margaret knelt slowly. The soup was still warm against her scrubs. She could smell the chicken broth and celery, could feel the weight of 40 eyes on her back. She gathered the scattered items, the tray, the bowl, the napkins, with deliberate care. Her movements were controlled, methodical, the opposite of flustered. When she straightened up, she held the tray in front of her with both hands. Then she let one tear escape. Just one. No trembling. No gasping breath. Just a single tear that tracked down her cheek while her eyes remained locked on Sterling's. The other resident shifted uncomfortably. Sterling's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Margaret wiped the tear away without breaking eye contact and spoke quietly, her voice carrying somehow despite the cafeteria noise. "I've held together men with worse wounds than your ego, Doctor." The silence was immediate and complete. It was the kind of silence that could crack glass. Sterling's face flushed red, a reaction that seemed to surprise him more than anyone else. His resident stared at him, watching to see how he would respond, watching to see if his authority had actually been challenged. Margaret set the tray on the nearest cart and walked toward the exit, leaving her phone face down on the table. Sterling didn't follow. He couldn't. Not without admitting he had been wounded by a pediatric nurse in front of an entire cafeteria of hospital staff. But when she was gone, his jaw clenched so hard one of the residents heard the noise. "Gentlemen," he said softly, "make a note of that." His voice sounded like a tank idling in a garage, mechanical, powerful, dangerous in its restraint. That evening, Sterling made phone calls. Margaret was retrieving Danny's chart for the night assessment when she caught sight of him through the glass partition of his office, receiver pressed to his ear, his face animated in a way she hadn't seen before. He was planning something. She knew the posture. She had seen it before in Tikrit, in the moment before operations shifted from theoretical to kinetic. The third humiliation came during morning rounds. The entire medical team, Sterling, the residents, the attending from cardiology, the ICU fellow, assembled outside Danny Mackenzie's room. The boy was sleeping, his small form barely creating a ridge under the hospital blanket. His father, Colonel James Mackenzie, stood in the corner of the room in his dress uniform, his hand resting on the window frame as if that proximity could somehow transmit fatherhood through glass. Sterling was mid-sentence when Margaret approached with the updated vital sheet and Danny's medication chart. "Recent labs are unchanged," he was saying, pointing at something on the tablet one of the residents held. "The inflammation markers suggest..." He stopped, noticed her. "Ah, Nurse Walsh. Perfect timing. Come here." She moved closer. Sterling pulled Danny's primary care chart from the stack on the rolling desk and held it out in front of him. Then he released it. The papers fell like a scatter bomb, pages spreading across the linoleum floor in a fan pattern. A few slid under the wall-mounted trash bin. Sterling's smile was lazy, predatory, designed to look accidental to anyone watching from a distance. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said. His residents exchanged glances. The cardiology attending pretended to examine her phone. "And next time, don't waste my time with your little questions about billing codes. You're here to follow orders, not think." Margaret crouched slowly. Her hands were steady as she gathered each page, stacking them in the proper order, the kind of order someone learns when medical accuracy saves lives. She could read the treatment codes upside down from this angle. Experimental decompression listed as urgent. Vascular imaging flagged as stat when the boy had no vascular injury. Infusion therapy marked as critical intervention when the boy's fluid balance was stable. The pattern was systematic. Someone was inflating these codes deliberately, billing military insurance for procedures Danny didn't need. She stood and handed Sterling the reassembled chart. "Yes, doctor," she said quietly. But her eyes lingered on the treatment codes, just long enough for Sterling to notice her noticing. His expression hardened in a way that was almost imperceptible. Almost. Margaret had trained her entire career to read micro-expressions the way other people read billboards. She saw it. The moment when he realized she had seen something. The moment when he began calculating how to remove her from the board. Danny stirred in his sleep. His small hand emerged from under the blanket and found the side rail, gripping it the way children do when the world feels uncertain. Colonel Mackenzie watched his blind son with the expression of a man who had seen combat and still couldn't protect what mattered most. Margaret's fingers went to the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the one with the embroidered insignia of the unit that no longer officially existed, the one that marked her as something other than what she appeared to be. She turned to continue with her other patients and nearly collided with Dr. Chen at the doorway. He steadied her with a hand on her elbow, his touch gentle but his eyes searching. "You okay?" His voice was low, meant only for her. "Fine," she said. But they both knew better. That evening, while Margaret was charting in the medication room, her phone vibrated in her pocket. An email from Sterling's office marked, "Confidential personnel matter." HR had questions. References needed verification. A discrepancy had been noted in her employment history. The tone was neutral. The threat was unmistakable. Sterling was moving from social destruction to institutional destruction, and he was moving quickly. She stared at her phone screen, watching the cursor blink in the empty reply field. Behind her, through the medication room window, she could see Sterling in the distance, already on his next phone call, already building his coalition. He was competent, she realized. That was what made him dangerous. He wasn't a bully who only had cruelty as a weapon. He was a bully who had institutional access, professional credibility, and allies in the places where decisions got made. Margaret closed the email and returned to her charting. Her hands didn't shake. Her jaw didn't tighten. She simply continued her work, continued her presence, continued to gather information. And when she checked Danny's chart one more time before the end of her shift, when she saw that Sterling had already ordered 3 more unnecessary procedures for the following day, she understood that this was going to escalate far beyond a break room bet or scattered lunch trays. But that wasn't the worst part. The monitors started screaming at 3:22 a.m. Margaret heard the code blue alarm from the break room before the overhead paged it, that particular pitch that meant pediatric ICU, that meant one of her patients. She was moving before the announcement finished, coffee cup abandoned on the Formica counter, muscle memory overriding the exhaustion that had settled into her bones during a 16-hour shift. The hallway stretched before her, fluorescent lights casting everything in that sterile white that made time feel suspended, unmeasurable. Danny Mackenzie's room erupted with controlled chaos, the kind of urgency that looks like panic to civilians but operates under a precise architecture of training and protocol. The 7-year-old's small frame was thrashing against the bed rails, his oxygen saturation dropping with each labored breath, the ventilator hissing its mechanical rhythm like an animal in distress. His chest rose and fell with the irregular desperation of a body fighting to pull air through compromised passages. Respiratory distress. But something else. Something deeper. Margaret stepped into the room and her eyes moved across the monitors with the practiced sweep of someone who had read vital signs in the dark, in sandstorms, in the roar of medevac helicopters. O2 sat at 71 and falling. Heart rate 156. Blood pressure climbing. The chest X-ray from 4 hours ago was still displayed on the monitor, but the pattern had changed. There was new density in the left hemithorax, a shadow that hadn't existed during rounds. The kind of shadow that meant internal bleeding, that meant the original shrapnel injury had been more extensive than the initial scans suggested. Tension pneumothorax. The original trauma had fractured ribs. Scar tissue had ruptured. Air was filling the pleural space, collapsing the lung, compressing the heart. It was the exact injury pattern she'd seen in a Navy pilot pulled from the Persian Gulf in 2009, the same cascading sequence she'd treated on a Marine with a penetrating wound near Camp Leatherneck. The pattern was as recognizable to her as a face, as inevitable as gravity. She moved to Danny's bedside without asking permission, her hands already moving toward the monitoring equipment, her voice dropping into the register that made residents listen without understanding why. He needs a chest decompression. Now. Get me a 14-gauge angiocath needle and prep the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. The nurses in the room froze. Margaret wasn't the attending. Margaret was 3 weeks into working a pediatric ICU at a hospital where she'd been given the thinnest of backgrounds and explicit instructions to remain invisible. But Margaret's hands were already finding the landmarks on Danny's small chest, her fingers reading the ribs like braille, and something in her certainty made the team move. One of the nurses grabbed the needle. Another prepared the skin with betadine. The moment stretched into that crystalline space where seconds matter more than policy, where a child's life narrows into the single point of a needle and the space between surviving and not. Margaret's hands were steady. Not the trembling steadiness of adrenaline, the flat, oceanic calm that came from having already survived the worst. The needle went in at the angle she'd learned in a field medicine course that didn't officially exist, the kind of course taught by instructors whose names were classified and whose methods didn't appear in civilian textbooks. The hiss of air escaping. O2 sat climbing. 75, 82. 88, stable. Danny's breathing synchronized with the ventilator, his small body relaxing into the sedation, the crisis collapsing from active emergency into manageable crisis. The nurses released breath they didn't know they'd been holding. Get respiratory to confirm placement, Margaret said, already stepping back. And get Dr. Sterling in here. But the words hadn't finished leaving her mouth when the door opened and the man himself appeared, still in yesterday's shirt, his hair disheveled in a way that suggested he'd been awakened by phone calls rather than having slept at all. His eyes moved across the scene, the decompression, the stabilizing vitals, Margaret standing at the bedside with her hands still positioned exactly where they'd been working, and his jaw tightened into something that looked like a muscle spasm. "Nurse Walsh," he said, and the courtesy in his voice was the most dangerous thing in the room. "Perhaps we should let the attending physician evaluate his own patient." She didn't respond. She was already backing away, already erasing her presence, already becoming the nurse who had been there but shouldn't have been, the shadow that had witnessed something and would be expected to forget it. Dr. Sterling turned to his team with the bearing of a commander surveying a battlefield. "Get me the emergency consultation room. I'm convening the full consultation in 30 minutes. I want cardiology, pulmonary, neurology, and whoever handles pediatric trauma." And pull every scan, every test result, every note on this case. The conference room at Mercy General was designed to look important: hardwood table, leather chairs, the kind of space where decisions were made and lives were sorted into categories. But this morning at 5:15 a.m., it looked like something else to Margaret, who stood just outside the closed door, pretending to review medication orders from a computer terminal positioned with perfect sightlines to the glass window. She could see them gathering. Dr. Sterling at the head of the table. And 4 others: Dr. Harding from cardiology, whose private practice billed roughly $3 million annually to military insurance claims. Dr. Chen from pulmonary, who had been cited in 3 separate billing audits. Dr. Vasquez from neurology, who had somehow accumulated a patient caseload consisting almost entirely of military families on premium coverage. And Dr. Morris, the pediatric trauma specialist who had consulted on Danny's case in the ER, who had signed off on Sterling's original assessment without reading the detailed imaging reports. 5 doctors. All of them connected by a financial architecture that Margaret had noticed in the billing codes, in the flagged insurance claims, in the trail of unnecessary procedures that had accumulated on Danny's chart like sediment in still water. These were the men Dr. Sterling called when he needed consensus. Not colleagues. Employees. Nodes in a network that generated revenue from the military's refusal to deny any treatment for the children of active duty personnel. She watched as Sterling distributed Danny's scans, the old ones, the ones from the initial trauma assessment, the ones that showed the shrapnel damage to the optic nerve, the irreversible injury that had stolen a 7-year-old's sight. The new ones weren't displayed. The ones that showed the compression, the tension pneumothorax, the injury pattern that existed in a different category of treatability, those stayed in the radiology system, separate, UN examined. Dr. Harding spoke first, his voice carrying the weight of false authority. Optic nerve damage is irreversible once the nerve fibers are severed. There's nothing we can do. Dr. Chen nodded. The prognosis is permanent blindness. Any further intervention would be futile. Dr. Vasquez pulled up a chart, one of the fraudulent ones, one of the procedure codes that had been inflated and resubmitted. We've already done everything possible. Continuing active treatment would constitute medical waste. Dr. Morris, the one who should have known better, simply said, "I agree with the consensus." Sterling leaned back in his chair with the satisfaction of a man watching a plan fall into place. Then we're in agreement. The appropriate course of action is to transition the patient to comfort care. The family should be informed that further treatment would be inadvisable. Terminate active treatment. That was the language they used. It meant stopping the decompression protocol, removing the monitoring, letting the pneumothorax reaccumulate, letting the boy's breathing deteriorate, letting the simple fact of his biology make the decision they couldn't make officially. Passive killing. The kind that looked like medical consensus instead of murder. Margaret remained motionless at the computer terminal, her hands positioned exactly as they would be if she were actually working, her face arranged in the expression of a nurse who hadn't seen anything, who wouldn't report anything, who understood her place in the hierarchy. But her eyes had moved across the scans visible on the conference room screens, and she had seen what every doctor in that room should have seen and deliberately hadn't. The compression pattern was unmistakable. The original shrapnel injury had fractured the orbital bone, but the bleeding had been contained initially. Hours of swelling, hours of pressure building in the limited space of a 7-year-old skull, and that pressure was reachable. Treatable. It could be relieved with a precise needle decompression through the orbital space, a procedure that took 12 minutes, that required no surgical team, that could restore partial vision if performed within a specific window of time. That window was closing. It had maybe 4 hours left before the cellular damage became permanent. The conference room door opened and Sterling emerged, his expression satisfied, moving toward the administrative offices to begin the paperwork that would downgrade Danny Mackenzie from active treatment to comfort care. The other 4 doctors dispersed in different directions, already back to their private practices, already disconnected from the decision they just collectively made. Margaret waited exactly 90 seconds. Then she walked away from the computer terminal and positioned herself in Sterling's path, timing it perfectly to intersect him between the conference room and his destination. "Doctor," she said quietly. I reviewed the imaging from this morning. There's a decompression pattern in the orbital bone, swelling that's putting pressure on the optic nerve. It's treatable. A needle decompression through the orbital space, we could relieve the pressure within hours. Dr. Sterling stopped. He turned to face her with the expression of a man who was being interrupted by something significantly beneath his notice. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet enough that the hallway traffic wouldn't catch it, private enough that no one else would know what he was saying. You've been here 3 weeks, Nurse Walsh. I've been practicing medicine for 23 years. I've performed approximately 6,000 surgical procedures. I've made decisions that affected approximately 3,000 patients. And I don't need a nurse with no verifiable credentials telling me how to manage a case that's already been fully evaluated by 5 attending physicians. He stepped closer. The hallway seemed to compress around him, the air pressure changing in a way that made breathing deliberate instead of automatic. His voice dropped another register, became something that didn't sound like threat because it sounded like fact. If you continue advocating for treatment that the attending physicians have collectively decided is contraindicated, you'll be demonstrating a pattern of insubordination. A pattern of behavior that would necessitate a report to hospital administration. A report that would make you unemployable not just here, but at any facility that values physician authority over nursing presumption. Do you understand what I'm saying? Margaret didn't flinch. She didn't retreat. She simply held his eyes with the calm of someone who had already survived worse, and then she turned and walked back toward the pediatric ICU, back toward Danny's room, back toward the monitors that were already showing the slow decline that came with passive termination of care. Sterling's phone call to the hospital administrator came at 6:43 a.m. The one to Dr. Patterson at Methodist came at 6:53. The one to her supposed previous employer came at 6:49, and he described a nurse who had been hired on questionable credentials, who was now demonstrating concerning patterns of judgment, who might pose a liability risk. By 7:15 a.m., Margaret's employment file had been flagged for review. By 7:48, the administrator had decided that the safest course of action was immediate termination. By 8:30, security would be escorting her out of the hospital, through the parking garage, past the morning shift arriving for their 12-hour rotations. But none of that had happened yet. In the small window between Sterling's activation of his network and the institutional machinery beginning to move, Margaret sat in Danny's room. The boy was sleeping, his oxygen saturation holding at 94%, his chest rising and falling with the synchronized rhythm of the ventilator. His small hand lay palm up on the blanket, and she could see the foresight, could see the precision of the initial stick, could see that he was stable enough, for now, to survive the next few hours if nothing changed. But things were going to change. The pneumothorax would reaccumulate. The pressure would rebuild. The window for intervention was closing with every passing minute. She touched the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the one that identified her as something that officially didn't exist, and her hands, those hands that had held together men with worse wounds than ego, made their choice. 3 in the morning. The hospital held its breath in that particular stillness that only exists between midnight and dawn, when the world belonged to the machines and the people who knew how to listen to them. Margaret moved through the pediatric ICU like someone who'd walked this path 1,000 times before, though Mercy General's 3rd floor was only 3 weeks old to her. Her hands knew where to go. The equipment she needed was already gathered, a sterile field kit, a 14-gauge needle, syringes filled with contrast, the precise instruments of decompression. She'd assembled them without hurrying, without drawing attention, her movements economical and sure. Danny Mackenzie lay unconscious in room 307, his 7-year-old face creased with the lines of chronic pain even in sleep. The oxygen monitor above his bed traced its steady rhythm. 2 full lines ran from his left forearm, one for fluids, one for the sedation that kept him mercifully unaware of the pressure building inside his skull, the pressure that was slowly, methodically, stealing the vision that the shrapnel had already taken. Margaret had seen this exact injury pattern before. Not in textbooks. In the field. In a forward operating base outside Fallujah, where a lance corporal with burns across 40% of his body had presented with the same facial swelling, the same elevated intracranial pressure, the same optic nerve being crushed from within by edema that no amount of steroids could touch. She'd saved that lance corporal with a needle and a steady hand. The room smelled of antiseptic and the particular mustiness of a child who'd been hospitalized too long, and under it all, faintly, the copper-edged scent of fear, not Danny's, but her own. Not fear of the procedure. Fear of what came after. The choice had already been made at 2:13 a.m. when she'd stood in the medication closet and acknowledged the truth, do nothing and watch a 7-year-old boy lose partial sight that could be preserved, or act and lose everything. The math was simple. The price was infinite. Margaret pulled on fresh gloves, the snap of latex against her wrists sharp in the quiet. She positioned the overhead light, angling it so she could see the precise location on Danny's face where the edema had created a bulge beneath his right eye. The second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. The needle would go through skin, through the layer of muscle, into the space where cerebrospinal fluid was backing up like floodwater behind a dam. One precise insertion. One release of pressure. One chance. She'd done this in a bunker under fire with her hands shaking from adrenaline and dust in her mouth. She could do this in a climate-controlled hospital room with a child who didn't know she was saving his life. The needle entered with a soft resistance, the give of tissue, and then the hiss of air escaping. Not her air. Not his air. The fluid that had been pressing against his optic nerve found its release, and Margaret watched Danny's face in the dim light, watched the child's unconscious body as if someone had loosened a rope around his chest. His breathing deepened. His jaw unclenched. The heart monitor, which had been running elevated at 118 beats per minute, began to drift downward. 115, 112. The numbers descended like someone letting water out of a bathtub. She secured the needle with gauze and tape, documented her work in the chart with clinical notation that revealed nothing, and stepped back. Danny Mackenzie gasped his first pain-free breath in 3 weeks. It was a small sound. Barely audible. But it was the sound of a child whose body had finally been given permission to rest, and Margaret felt something in her sternum release, not relief, because relief required safety, and she had just guaranteed the opposite. She was still standing there when Dr. Sterling appeared in the doorway. His phone was already at his ear, his body filling the frame with the peculiar authority of a man who'd never once had to doubt his right to occupy space. His eyes moved from Danny to the equipment on the bedside table to Margaret's face, and she watched him read the situation the way a hunter reads a blood trail. "Security," he said into the phone, his voice soft and conversational. "We have an employee who just performed an unauthorized procedure on a patient. I need her removed from the building immediately." He paused, listening. "No, I'll wait. She should be processed before the morning shift arrives." He ended the call without looking at her, just pocketed his phone and smiled, the smile of a man who'd already made his calculations and was confident in the result. Margaret said nothing. She waited with the particular patience of someone who'd waited out ambushes, who understood that words were currency and she was about to be bankrupt. Dr. Sterling walked past her to Danny's bedside, examined the gauge pad taped to the child's face, and let out a low whistle. "Field medicine," he murmured, almost to himself. "Impressive. Reckless. Impressive." He looked back at her. "You know, in my 32 years of practice, I've never seen someone torpedo their career quite so efficiently. Didn't even last a month." The security guards arrived at 3:43 a.m., 2 men in grey uniforms with the awkward positioning of people who didn't quite understand the situation but had been given orders. They didn't touch her. They didn't need to. Margaret walked ahead of them down the corridor, past the supply closet where she'd stood 2 hours earlier, past the nurse's station where Dr. Chen the anesthesiologist was just arriving for the early shift and stopped dead when he saw her flanked by security, past the elevator that would take her out of the building and out of the life she'd constructed. Dr. Sterling watched from his office window on the 2nd floor as security walked her across the parking lot. His phone was already in his hand, already making calls. She heard later, much later, after everything changed, that he'd contacted board members at 4 a.m., called 3 separate hospital donors by 5:30, and spent the early morning claiming to call her references, demanding to know why they'd hired a problem employee with a history of insubordination and recklessness. He painted a picture of a woman who couldn't follow protocols, who thought her judgment superseded institutional authority, who'd endangered a child in pursuit of some personal agenda. The lie was so close to the truth that it almost worked. By 6:33 a.m., Margaret Walsh held a termination letter in her hand, her employment at Mercy General concluded for gross insubordination and violation of medical protocols. She signed the papers in the administrative office without reading them fully, one measured breath, the kind of breath a person takes when they're about to dive underwater and aren't sure how long they'll need to hold it. The administrator, a woman named Mrs. Patterson who'd hired her 3 weeks earlier with genuine warmth, avoided her eyes. This was how power worked. Not with rage. With distance. With the simple acknowledgement that Margaret had ceased to exist in any institutional sense that mattered. She walked out through the lobby at 7:15 a.m. while the morning shift was arriving, their fresh scrubs and coffee cups and small talk creating a wall of normalcy that she passed through like a ghost. Dr. Chen watched from the medication station, his jaw tight, understanding something had happened but not understanding what. She didn't have the luxury of explaining. She didn't have the authority to tell him the truth. 3 days passed. She sat in the waiting room of the Houston VA Medical Center on a Friday morning, surrounded by the particular texture of military life, men and women in worn combat jackets, some with obvious scars, some with invisible ones. The intake coordinator had handed her a form. Name. Social security number. Date of birth. And then the question that stopped her cold, military service. Dates. Branch. Rank. Margaret stared at the blank line beneath that question. Around her, a Black Hawk pilot with a mechanical arm filled out his form with brutal efficiency. A Marine with a TBI survivor's 1,000-yard stare waited for his mental health appointment. An Army medic who looked about 40 sat quietly, his hands folded in his lap, the tremor of old shrapnel injuries visible when he moved. She could write it. She could put down Senior Chief Petty Officer. She could list the dates, 2003 to 2015. She could claim the identity that was actually hers, the one that existed in classified files in a basement at the Pentagon, the one she'd been ordered to erase from every civilian record, every background check, every version of herself that lived in the normal world. She picked up the pen. Hovered it over the blank line. And then she set it down and walked out of the VA hospital at 10:42 a.m., leaving the form on the desk, her military service unclaimed, her medical need unaddressed, her existence suspended between two impossible truths: she was a combat veteran with sealed records, or she was nobody at all. Outside, the Texas heat wrapped around her like a blanket someone had just pulled from a dryer. She stood in the parking lot for 5 minutes, her hands at her sides, her face blank in a way that suggested she'd learned long ago how to make her face blank. 3 weeks of a new identity as a nurse. 3 days as a fired employee. And now, nobody. The in-between space where people fell when their missions ended and their lives hadn't quite started. Her phone would ring the next morning. But that was tomorrow. Right now, in this moment, Margaret Walsh, Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh, stood alone in the Houston heat, and the weight of the unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining felt like the only real thing she still owned. Ryan Walsh was 17, 5'9", and moving like a man on a mission. He stormed past the front desk at Mercy General at 6:06 a.m., before visiting hours, clutching a shadow box of medals against his chest like a battering ram. His voice carried across the lobby, sharp enough to make 3 nurses look up from their computers at once. "I need to see someone in administration. Now. About my mom." The head of nursing, Patricia Gomez, a woman who'd survived 2 reorganizations and a hostile takeover bid, was finishing her second coffee when Ryan appeared at her office door. He didn't ask permission. He didn't wait. He set the shadow box on her desk, opened it with trembling hands, and said 5 words: "They need to see these." Patricia's hands went cold. She recognized the presentation immediately. Navy medals. Military issue. The kind of shadow box that hangs in the homes of active duty families and the offices of classified operatives. Her eyes moved across the ribbons, reading them the way another person might read a biography. She picked up the file Ryan had prepared, printouts, documents, service records that should not have existed 3 days ago, and began to read. The trembling started in her fingertips and moved up her arms. Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh. 3 tours in the Middle East. Service record sealed pending National Security Review. Bronze Star with Valor Citation. Purple Heart. Navy Commendation Medal. A discharge date that matched the day she'd walked into Mercy General and asked for a pediatric nursing position, using a name that wasn't exactly a lie but wasn't exactly her whole truth either. "What is this?" Patricia whispered. "The truth," Ryan said. "About my mom." The hospital administrator arrived 12 minutes later, along with a man Patricia recognized from a single briefing she'd attended for years ago. Master Chief Patterson, 72 years old, silver-haired, with the kind of posture that made furniture seem inadequate. His uniform was dress blues, perfectly pressed. His presence made the air in the room feel different, the way pressure changes before a storm. Ryan stepped back. Even at 17, he understood what rank meant. Master Chief Patterson looked at the shadow box. He looked at Patricia. He looked at the service records. Then he began to speak, and his voice was like a tank idling in a garage, low, steady, terrifying in its calm. Bronze Star with Valor. He lifted the first ribbon, held it to the light. Fallujah, 2004. She pulled 3 wounded airmen from a burning vehicle. Enemy fire, 40 seconds of exposure, no hesitation. He set it down. Patricia's coffee cup rattled against its saucer. Purple Heart. The second medal. Ramadi, 2005. IED shrapnel, 3 inches from her femoral artery. The corpsman who treated her said she didn't make a sound. Just told him to seal it and get her mobile. Another medal moved to the front of the box. Navy Commendation Medal. The third. His voice didn't change pitch, but something about the way he held it made it feel heavier than gold. Operation Eager Justice, Helmand Province, 2007. Classified. What I can tell you is that Senior Chief Walsh extracted a high-value target from a location that didn't officially exist. She was wounded doing it. She should have died doing it. Instead, she got the target out and called for medevac while applying her own tourniquet. He turned the medal in the light. When they found her, she was conscious. Still in the fight. That's not bravery. That's a different kind of person entirely. Patricia's hand had moved to her mouth. Ryan was watching his former commanding officer with the kind of reverence that comes from knowing the gap between the public world and the classified one. After that operation, Master Chief Patterson continued, the Navy made a decision. Senior Chief Walsh's operational record was sealed. Her identity was essentially erased from official channels. She was given new documents, civilian cover, and explicit orders to disappear into the private sector. National security. No exceptions. No explanation to her civilian employers. No way to tell anyone who she really was without breaking federal law. The door opened. An FBI agent entered, Justice Department credentials on a lanyard, the kind of calm that comes from having seen worse things than anyone in this room. "I can confirm the classified operation," the agent said. "We've been investigating billing fraud across 3 healthcare systems. The circumstances around Senior Chief Walsh's employment discharge are relevant to that investigation." She placed a folder on the desk. The Navy placed her in civilian cover specifically. Her hiring here was legitimate. Her discharge was retaliation for discovering financial crimes. That's documented now. But that wasn't when it got quiet. That was when Jake Morrison walked in. Jake was 34, a Marine veteran, a hospital IT specialist with a prosthetic left leg, the result of an RPG that didn't quite finish what it started in Anbar Province in 2009. He moved through the room with the careful efficiency of someone who'd relearned how to exist in his own body, and he was holding a hard drive no larger than a car key. His voice was parade ground loud, the kind of volume that came from having given orders in desert dust and learned never to apologize for being heard. "Dr. Sterling," he said, though Sterling wasn't in the room yet. Didn't matter. The words were on record now. At 3 a.m. last night, you accessed the security system from your personal computer and attempted to delete footage spanning 6 months of camera feeds in the ICU and the administrative hallway. Jake moved to Patricia's laptop, plugged in the drive, and the screen filled with images. The first frame showed Dr. Sterling meeting with a pharmaceutical representative in an empty exam room, pharmaceutical brochures spread across the counter, a cash envelope sitting openly on the chair between them. The timestamp read 2:14 a.m., 3 weeks ago. Jake clicked forward. Another image. Dr. Sterling at his office computer, altering billing codes on patient records. The charges were being inflated, procedure counts doubled, imaging studies marked as emergency interventions when they were routine. Another click. Video this time. Sound this time. Dr. Sterling's voice, like gravel in a blender, maximized the procedure count on the Mackenzie kid. His father's military insurance will never question it. We can get another $80,000 out of this case if we're smart about it. A child. He was billing fraud against a blind child. Patricia's face had gone the color of old bone. Master Chief Patterson's jaw didn't move, but something behind his eyes went very still. The FBI agent reached for the drive without asking permission. "We've been investigating billing fraud across 3 hospitals," the agent said, and her voice was the sound of institutional consequences. "This hard drive provides the pattern we needed. Sterling's methodology, his network, his profit margin. Everything." She held the drive up to the light. Every piece of it documented. Dr. Sterling's network should have protected him. That's how networks work. You make enough calls, you know enough people, the system absorbs the impact and you walk away slightly embarrassed but fundamentally unharmed. That's the structure of institutional power. That's the trade-off of being on the inside. The calls started going out. Sterling must have made them from somewhere in the hospital because by 7:23 a.m., his network had begun to collapse like a building losing its support columns one by one. His first call was to a board member, a man who owed him favors, who'd benefited from his recommendations, who should have picked up. The call went to voicemail. The second call to a pharmaceutical company executive who'd been providing him consulting fees for speaking engagements that were just him existing in rooms where decisions were made. She didn't answer either. By the time the hospital attorney arrived at Patricia's office door with a suspension letter and a recommendation for criminal referral, Sterling's network had transformed from an asset into a liability. People who'd been friendly were suddenly unavailable. People who'd accepted his gifts were suddenly distant. The structure that had held him up for years had become a house of cards being systematically dismantled by a hard drive no larger than a car key. He tried one final play. Security brought him to Patricia's office at 8:15 a.m., and he looked like something that had partially collapsed. His shirt was untucked. His face was the color of old brick. He opened his mouth and whatever he'd planned to say came out as fury instead. She performed an unauthorized procedure. She violated every protocol. She should be in federal prison, not working in this hospital. Patricia held up Danny Mackenzie's latest scan, imaging from this morning, the latest round of ophthalmologic assessment. Her voice didn't shake. Voices like hers never did. "Dr. Sterling, the procedure she performed saved that child's optic nerve. Our head of ophthalmology confirmed this morning that Danny is showing early signs of light perception recovery. Visual acuity at roughly 20/400. He can identify shapes. He can see light." She lowered the scan. 5 doctors said it was impossible. 1 nurse proved every single one of them wrong. The silence that followed was so thick you could operate in it. Sterling tried to speak. His mouth opened and closed like a fish in a tank gradually running out of oxygen. Nothing came out. Security, the same two guards who'd escorted Margaret out 3 days ago, moved toward him with the kind of inevitability that doesn't require force. They didn't touch him. They didn't need to. He stood and walked, and everyone watched him go, and nobody spoke until the elevator doors closed. Master Chief Patterson's expression hadn't changed. His voice, when he spoke, was barely above a whisper. Senior Chief Walsh saved my life twice. Once in the field. Once just now, by proving that system still works. He looked at Patricia. Where is she? Patricia's hands moved across her keyboard. Hospital Employee Directory. Margaret Walsh, Pediatric Nursing, part-time, pending administrative review. But there was an address. A phone number. A photograph from her hiring file, Margaret in civilian clothes, her eyes carefully neutral, her posture carefully small, exactly like someone trying not to be noticed. Ryan had his phone out before Patricia could dial. He was calling his mother. He was telling her to come back to the hospital. He was telling her that everything was about to change. And in a strip mall across Houston, in a folding chair at a folding table, Dr. Sterling was about to spend the next 8 hours selling supplemental insurance policies to people who didn't want to buy them, his medical license revoked, his network scattered into the wind like ashes, his 3 specialist collaborators already accepting plea deals to minimize their own exposure. His business cards read Sterling Insurance Services, supplemental medical policies. His phone didn't ring. Nobody stopped at his table. The wind kept blowing his cards into the parking lot, and he kept picking them up, again and again, in the Houston heat. But that was tomorrow. Right now, in the lobby of Mercy General, a 17-year-old boy was watching his mother walk through the doors for the first time in 72 hours, and Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret and Walsh, the nurse they tried to erase, the operative they tried to silence, the woman they tried to break, was about to learn that the unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining wasn't just a memory anymore. It was evidence. It was vindication. It was her real name, finally spoken out loud in a place that mattered. If you or someone you know has witnessed medical fraud or unethical billing practices in a healthcare setting, please report it. Your evidence could protect vulnerable patients and families. Contact your state medical board, the FBI's Healthcare Fraud Hotline, or the Department of Justice's Civil Fraud Division. Documentation matters. Truth matters. And whistleblowers save lives. If this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and comment. Tell us about a time when someone proved the doubters wrong.